Okay, so before we head out, I'm going to show you first the gear that I'll be using. So of course, the Canon AE1 program, 50mm f1.8. Next is the film. The film that I'm going to be using is Photos Film 400. So this one I got from Image Craftsman here in Macau, and they told me that it resembles Portra, but of course this is a cheaper film stock. Well, there's a surplus of it here in Macau, so I'm just going to be shooting this as a test roll. No biggie. Okay, so before we start taking pictures, let's open up the app, Lightmeter. Okay, so as soon as you open up your app, you can see at the very bottom there's lightmeter, there's pinhole, and then there's flash. Right now we're going to be using lightmeter. Then you have this viewing element, so you can see where your camera is pointing at. You have time, which is shutter speed, f number, which is aperture, and ISO, which is, well, ISO. So that's your exposure triangle. It is a bright day out right now, and I usually have f5.6 as my base aperture. From there, I can adjust which aperture I want as long as I'm happy with the shutter speed that my meter is showing. Now let's set the ISO to 400 because that is the speed indicated on the box. So again, the ISO is set to 400 and the base aperture is at 5.6. The shutter speed that is set for me is 500. So I'm going to be using these values first. So 500, 5.6, ISO 400. Let me take a picture. All right, 3, 2, 1. So it's up to you if you want to fiddle around with other apertures. So let's say I want to use f4. The shutter speed that's given to me is 1000. So just set it there. f4 at 1000. Let's take another exposure. All right. What if I want to use f16? Another picture. Okay, so what we're actually doing is called reciprocity, which is another way of saying you could change whatever setting you have on your camera, but basically you're shooting at the same lighting situation. You can see the change in the depth of field with these shots. So adding and taking away stops do not change the exposure value. A stop is a measurement of exposure. If you just keep adding or subtracting stops, your exposure value will differ. But if you follow reciprocity, you have to add one if you plan on subtracting one. Without getting too technical, exposure is how much light there is in a scene, and its value is what the light meter registers. The Pokeballs were all shot with the same exposure value, just with different apertures and their corresponding shutter speeds. So first thing we have to do is we have to understand the scene. So I'm going to create a panoramic first. Let's try to visualize the scene in black and white. So I want to take a decent shot of this entire park with the Eiffel Tower and the Parisian behind it. You have to understand the lighting scenario in this scene. Which is the brightest light, which is the darkest dark, and which is the mid-tone. So basically you just take an exposure reading for the mid-tones. Okay, so the one that's closest to me that I consider as the mid-tone is the grass. My meter reading is f5.6, 4,000th of a second. However, my camera can only do 1/1000th of a second. What do? So I just have to adjust my aperture until I get what I need. So I have f8 2000 still high, f11 at 1000. So I'm going to shoot at f11 1/1000th of a second, ISO 400. All right, that's pretty much it, I guess. All right. Okay, so what if I want to shoot for the shadows? So the closest one near me is, well, this one. So the meter reading I'm getting is at 5.6. I should shoot at 1/1000th of a second. So let's try that. F5.6, 1/1000th of a second. F5.6, 1/1000th of a second. Here we go. What about the highlights? What if I want to shoot the highlights? Oh, well, we can try the gravel. F5.6, 8000. All right, so let's try to bump it up until I get something. So F22. Well, luckily I have F22 in my camera. I never shot F22 before. Let's see what it looks like. F22 at 1/1000th of a second. Oh boy. 3, 2, 1. Well, basing on experience, I guess the first exposure is going to be correct. The second one is going to be a bit overexposed, and then the third one is going to be underexposed. Basically, what we just did is trying to understand the lighting in the situation, and that's, I guess, your introduction to the zone system. So you know what your darkest dark is, what your brightest light is, and what is the midtone, and it's up to you what you want to meter for. Cool thing about the zone system is that if you have the dark end of the scale to the darkest part of the exposure and the light end of the scale to the lightest part of the exposure, somewhere in the middle is your midtone. However, since we are not using any fancy spot meters, we have to make do with just finding similar lighting.